Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night, whatever time zone, whatever part of the world you're joining from. I'm Garrett Nelson, the curator of maps at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. And this is the second installment of our Angles on Bending Lines exhibition. Like last week, I'm going to start a little early with a behind the scenes tour. It's only 12:55 here in Eastern time zone. We've promised you a 1 p.m. start. So in these 5 minutes, as we wait for people to virtually shuffle into the auditorium, I'm going to talk about an object that's not in bending lines, but that is related to it. And actually, today's objects are not only related to bending lines, but they are related to what's going on in our world, the crises that the United States is facing right now, the demands for racial justice, which are sweeping through the country, long historical arc of struggle and protests that have led up to the present day. And we're seeing the effect in our politics, on the streets and in demonstrations of a promise of justice that has not been kept in over centuries of American history. And we think a lot at the Map Center about the way that maps and data, visualizations and geography have both shown and reinforced the patterns of segregation, inequality, injustice that characterize American history. So the behind the scenes images I want to show you today are a set of maps, actually part of a book that was produced by a geographer by the name Bill Bungay. Now, if you've had a chance to look at the exhibition, you might recognize the name Bill Bungay. He produced a fascinating poster of anti-nuclear war maps that are in the exhibition. Bungay was a radical cartographer, active from the 60s to the 80s primarily, and did a lot of work mapping sort of social justice questions. And in 1971, following on several years of urban field research in the years that followed the 1967 uprisings in Detroit, Bungay published a book called Fitzgerald, Geography of a Revolution. And Fitzgerald is really a fascinating text. It's, in my mind, one of the most amazing combinations of cartography, historical geography, urban studies, and a really clear political message in this work. What Bungay did was he spent time with activists, Black activists in Detroit, working through the causes of the racial unrest and the racial injustice in that city that had led up to militarized policing, militarized confrontations between the state and its own citizens that are not very dissimilar to the ones that we're seeing today. Fitzgerald, toward the beginning of that book, the book was published in 1971, again, following a few years of urban field research that Bungay called the Detroit Geographic Expedition. And towards the beginning, he uses this map looking at the area of major riots in Detroit and highlighting the neighborhood Fitzgerald, from which the book takes its name. Using the very simple line maps, Bungay got his training as a data analyst, somebody who is really interested in mathematical models in geography. We'll actually be talking about him very briefly later in this talk because he published a paper on mathematical models for gerrymandering. But he became more and more interested in using those models to understand urban social justice and also combining them with non-mathematical, non-quantitative ways of understanding the city. So Fitzgerald is really interesting because it's also a piece of urban social anthropology. He worked really closely with activists in the city. Here you see a photo of Gwendolyn Warren, a young woman who is really in some ways the co-author of this book, worked really closely with Bungay on this project. And what Bungay what he does in this book, Fitzgerald, is to bring together a long historical arc of looking at questions around land exploitation. He goes back to the histories of colonial settlement and the removal of American Indians from the part of the world that would eventually become Detroit. And he combines that with a statistical and spatial analysis of economic geography. So in this map, he's looking at money transfers, the way that the slums were constructed through lending and rental practices, and money was literally sucked out of racialized slums. The term that was used, of course, we rarely use the term slums anymore, but Bungay was seeking to show that these slums had been created by deliberate exploitative practices, which had used race as one of their leverages of power and taken money and resources out of the center of Detroit, distributed into these wealthy, segregated suburbs. And so in this book, Bungay is combining statistical maps like this one with historical maps. Of course, at the Map Center, we have amazing historical resources about the city of Boston. This was Bungay looking at an 1876 map of what would again become the Fitzgerald neighborhood of Detroit, and finding land use records that referred to some of the area's first Black residents, including a man by the name of J. F. Canada, who would later get a square named after him during the 20th century. So Fitzgerald is just the way that it uses these historical sources, and it really represents Bungay discovering a historical way of thinking and combining it with his urban social analysis and these kind of critical social scientific perspectives on cartography, makes it not only a fascinating kind of prelude to today's talk, but of course something which has a lot of relevance on the present day. I actually just happened to notice that Fitzgerald is available free through Project Muse, the John Hopkins digital publishing platform. So if you Google, it's a long link, I didn't want to put it in the banner here, but if you Google Fitzgerald, Bungay, and Project Muse, you'll find it. And we'll post more information about it later as well. So it's now 1 o'clock. For those of you tuning in at 1, we're just finishing our little behind the scenes tour that began at 12:55. I'm talking about William Bungay's 1971 book, Fitzgerald, Geography of a Revolution. And in doing so, I want to acknowledge what's going on in the world today, in the United States in particular, the protests for racial justice that have spread across the entire country, demanding the rights that have long been denied to minority groups, people of color in the United States, demanding that we address systemic questions of racial injustice, of police violence. And some of what we're going to is deeper. Oh, I don't know if everybody else saw that, but I just became a little spinning wheel for a second on my broadcast, so I'm back. Voting rights, of course, have been one of the ways of enforcing racial hierarchies in the United States all the way back to its founding. And in today's talk, we're going to be thinking about the way that maps have been used to enforce unfair voting practices, particularly through gerrymandering, but also through other methods of kind of data and power. Data and power, of course, is one of the key themes of our new exhibition, Bending Lines, Maps, and Data from Distortion to Deception, of which this interview is a feature part. If you haven't had a chance yet, please visit the digital exhibition, the URL that you see at the bottom of the screen. It's also prominently linked from the front page of our website, leventhalmap.org. And that digital exhibition is designed in a way for you to explore the objects in depth. It's much more than just a list of thumbnail images and short captions. It's really an online first experience meant to take the place of the physical exhibition, which we will hopefully be mounting in the Boston Public Library at a future date when we are able to access that space again. So I have a wonderful guest and an old friend in conversation with me today. Alasdair Rae is a professorial fellow in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Sheffield. He's the author of numerous works on data studies and author or the co 19. All right, Alasdair, can we get you on here?
Hello.
Hi, Ali. How are you?
Good, thanks. And I am about 5,000 kilometers away, but hopefully the signal's okay.
I can hear you loud and clear. And Ali sent along the Wikipedia article for Highland English, in case anybody needs translations from his Scottish background. But I'm sure you'll be able to make sense of him as best as possible. So,
Yeah.
Ali, it's great to have you here. We're so glad to have one of the world's really leading experts in data visualization and the role of those of GIS and mapping in the media, in urban spatial analysis. It's great to have you here. I thought maybe you could start by saying a little bit about your background and how you came to GIS and cartography and get interested in some of the things that you do.
Yeah, I will do. Hopefully the signal's been breaking up a little bit. I've noticed that in the comments, so hopefully it'll be okay. But how did I get into data and GIS? Well, probably because of the bitterly cold winter of 1995, when I decided that I no longer wanted to be a postman or a mailman, as you would call it, delivering in record low temperatures, and I thought I should go to university. And that's basically why I went to study geography, because I thought hard about what I liked and what I was interested in. And when I was at school in the Highlands in the north of Scotland, I was really particularly taken by geography, and we did a lot of human geography, looking at things like geographical patterns of inequality, global injustice from a geographical perspective, all that kind of thing. It was really, it really interested me, the human aspect of things. And obviously I like maps, but for me, it's more about the world and the people in it. That's what interests me. The maps are cool, but it's what they do and what they tell us and how they can help us shape and influence, I suppose. And then I went to study at university. I did a geography degree, first of all, and then I did a master's degree in the States at Ohio State, and I did a PhD at Liverpool.
Great. And you know, the way you frame it, and maps aren't so, it's not that they're interesting on their own, but that they're interesting in the way that what they tell us about people. And you've really done a lot of amazing work in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere, kind of connecting maps to politics, to current events, to helping us understand the world that we live in. And we're showing one of your maps, though I sometimes call it a chart or a visualization. It plays very interestingly with the language of cartography. We're showing it in our Bending Lines exhibition, and it's called The Shape of American Democracy. Let's bring it up here.
Okay.
All right. So tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here.
Yeah, well, we're looking at lots of red and blue shapes, obviously. But if you look closer like you are now, you'll see that these are the 435 US congressional districts. So this is from the, currently we're in the 116th US Congress. This is from the previous session. And I studied and been interested in gerrymandering and the shape of political units for a long time. In the UK, they're a lot more uniform. We have 650 constituencies, roughly equal in population, but they're not so unusually shaped. And that's for a number of different reasons. But when I was studying in the geography department at Ohio State University, one of our classes, we talked about this issue as a way to try and understand, some of the politics of, the politics of a GIS, geographic information, and those kind of things. So I was interested in it, and I thought it'd be interesting to look at the shapes of congressional districts and then order them from top left to bottom right based on their irregularity. So that's what we're looking at. Top left, Maryland, 3rd congressional district, I believe. The least regular, according to the so-called Paulsby-Popper measure. And the bottom right, we have a single square, essentially, for Wyoming.
So I want to come back in a second to that idea of irregularity and the Polsby-Popper score, which you use to calculate these. But first, it's such a striking chart because it breaks away from geography. We're so used to seeing these districts in their kind of geographic place on a map of the United States, and that makes it much more difficult to compare one to the other, both because they're very different sizes, right? Wyoming is much larger than a single congressional district in New York or Los Angeles. But also because they aren't juxtaposed next to one another. So like a radically simple visual intervention like the one that you've made here, which is to scale all of them essentially to a cell in this table, and then to rank them, and then to use simple coloring to show their which party held the seat, and at the time of the 115th Congress. It makes such a visually arresting argument about the heterogeneity of these districts, as well as the way that gerrymandering has a pattern that runs in between the political parties. It's not as if all of the most gerrymandered districts are Democratic and all of them at least are Republican or vice versa. But we see the way that gerrymandering has been used both to restrict parties' seats, as well as to give other parties, the parties that were doing gerrymandering, as many seats as possible. So let's back up briefly and talk about gerrymandering and how it came to get that name and how it came to become a political practice. We also showed this object in Bending Lines. It's a political broadside from the 1820s that purported to give a natural and political history of the gerrymander in 2 chapters with cuts. So the original gerrymander was in 1812, and really it should be called the Gerrymander because it was a play on words of Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry. And what Gerry did was he redrew a state senate map in Massachusetts, just northeast of Boston here, in Essex County, around the city of Salem. He redrew the boundaries so that it would favor his own party in the upcoming election. And enterprising cartoonists, took the outline of that newly created district and made it look like this. This is a reproduction of the original political cartoon that said it was Elbridge Gerry's salamander. And that name stuck, and we still use the term gerrymandering today to refer to the practice of drawing creative electoral districts that are meant to give one party a favorable treatment, make the electoral map less competitive for the opposing party, or rather to stack the competition so that it's much easier for the gerrymandering the party that is doing the gerrymandering to win seats, and much harder for its opponents to win seats. Can you tell us anything about how you went about thinking the history of gerrymandering and the way that drawing bound states, at least, played in the work that you did here?
I just missed a little bit of what you said after. Can you tell me a bit? Sorry.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you thought about the history of gerrymandering and the use of geographic information in political manipulation in United States history? Obviously, Elbridge Gerry was not using a GIS, but how does the history of map drawing come to bear on both the chart that you did, as well as the ways that we use GIS and map making in the present?
Well, for me, answering this question is a little bit of an opportunity to take a step back from the technology and just talk about what we think of GIS as being for, or it might not be GIS, any kind of digital tools that we have today. Are they simply tools to reinforce some kind of status quo? You can do that by drawing lines with a pen, or you can do it with the latest technology. So for me, the broader questions here are about understanding the way that powerful people might be able to use the latest tools to reinforce and perpetuate existing imbalances of power, however they might be. So And I should say here, of course, that I'm using the United States as an example here, not to say that the country I live in is any better or worse, but it's just an example that's very well known and, of course, easily available data. So I guess the question, going back to the Elbridge Gerry, which I learned a little bit about him, and as a vice president, and trying to understand his previous history and looking at the background of all this. It's interesting, but for me, it tells a story of the need to do more work and engage with the technology, maybe in a more critical way. And talking of which, the kind of work that people at Moonduchin have done and their the metric geometry and gerrymandering group has been particularly influential in my thinking. Although I haven't done much on this, and this Shape of American Democracy graphic was really just a little experiment. So yeah, I mean, there's a variety of things going on with what I'm trying to do, but it's partly me trying to educate myself.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about the way that we measured gerrymandering. Since you mentioned Moonduchin and her project at Tufts University, they've done excellent work. They're our neighbors here in Boston. And we're going to be showing in a little bit a digital project that they've done that's also embedded into the Bending Lines digital catalog. But let's back up and think a little bit about the process of gerrymandering, right?
Yeah.
There are two ways that political parties can get what they want with gerrymandering. Ideally, a political party wants to spread its voters around so that there's just enough of them in every district to win. In an ideal situation, a political party has 51% of the vote in every one of a state's districts, because then they could potentially win every district, even if they only are 51% of the voters overall. So there's two ways to do that. We call them packing and cracking, right? In packing, party will take all of its opponents, all of the areas that are likely to vote for its opponent, and pack them all into a single district. So if we're the Republican Party, let's say, and we know where Democrats live, we can make a twisting, winding district that collects all of the Democrats in the state, or as many Democrats in the state as possible, so that we know that they'll get that district, and then all of the rest of the districts in our state will fall to Republicans. That's called packing. Cracking is splitting apart your own vote into as many possible districts as so that you can get that 51% threshold, right? So if you have, if let's say you're a Democrat trying to create a gerrymandered map, and you know that many of your voters live in the central city, then you want to combine that central city with the suburbs in a way so that there's about 51% of your voters in each one of those districts, so that you can spread apart their power as much as possible. And what's difficult is that what's difficult to prove in gerrymandering, when we talk about challenging it in the courts and showing that a party has committed gerrymandering, what's difficult to prove is that people live in clusters that have political tendencies, right? We know in the United States, at least right now, that Democrats tend to cluster in larger cities. Rural areas tend to have more Republican voters. And so there are ways in which the natural underlying geography of partisan behavior automatically creates groupings. When we want to show that a district has been gerrymandering, we can look at things like the outcomes of elections and say, well, this state has 51% Republicans and 49% Democrats, and yet the Republicans took all of the seats. But that doesn't necessarily say that for sure the districts have been gerrymandering. And that's why this idea of compactness, does the district look weird, essentially? Is this the kind of district boundaries that you would draw if you were being honest or impartial? How well do the actual boundaries of this district match that kind of ideal of a compact, well-formed district? And so you use the VRDI's GIS package to compute the Polsby-Popper score for each of these districts. You want to tell us a little more about that?
Yes. The Polsby-Popper score, Polsby and Popper are two now retired, I think, former law professors in the United States. And they devised a very simple measure. It's very commonly used, and some people would say it's flawed, but it's a measure of compactness. So what it does is it measures the ratio of the area of a shape. In this case, it's a district, to the area of a circle with the same perimeter. So how easily would it fit? How much of a circle would it fit if you put it inside it? So that's a measure of compactness. And, I calculated that for each of the congressional districts. And there's things that we fundamentally understand, and that's part of the graphic that I've tried to encode using things that we already get. And one of those things is color. So in the UK, we understand what color political parties are. It's even simpler in the United States because we have the red and the blue colors. And then we also understand, in this case, location is less important than shape, which is why I've done it in table format. So really, Paulsby Popper, if you want to be less formal about it, is how weird do the shapes look, and it gives you a score. And then what I've done with all those 435 shapes, which very conveniently actually breaks up into 15 times 29 or 5 times 87, so that happens to be divisible, and it makes a nice matrix. And they are ranked according to their Paulsby Popper score. There's a number of complications, things to do with coastlines and rivers and so on. Mm-hmm. But essentially, this is what you get if you what I've done is I've controlled for the coastline. So some of those highly indented coastlines, they appear where they should rather than where they are based on their slightly wiggly coastlines. Are you there? Maybe I've lost you, Garrett. Hopefully you'll come back. Oh. I don't know if anybody can hear me, but I cannot hear. Okay, thanks, Eric. So it looks like Garrett's, he told me yesterday when we did a practice run of this that he has slightly less high-speed internet in his apartment. Well, thankfully, I have enough here. So I'll just add a little bit into what I should say about this relation to the comments. The comparison with the UK 650 constituencies, and they are basically determined by an independent electoral commission that covers the whole country. And Garrett's back. Hi, Garrett.
Did you carry on without me, Ali?
Yeah. I tried to fill in, but what I was going to say was about some of the comments I've asked about the UK, and I was saying how we have 650 constituencies determined by an electoral commission, which is independent, and changing those shapes is very complicated and very contested, as you'd expect. But we don't have such unusual shapes. And if you were to look on the internet for evidence of gerrymandering and such like in the UK, you would probably see references in the past to things that have happened in Northern Ireland, particularly in the 60s, around the civil rights movement there. So that's usually, but not to say it doesn't exist here, but it would be much, much harder to achieve just based on the organizational structures we have.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the practice of drawing tricky boundaries has been used not just for electoral districting, but for all sorts of political power. In fact, we looked at a map of Northern Ireland on the broadcast last week during the Home Rule debate of 1920, where Irish nationalists were essentially accusing the UK government of creating a Northern Ireland that would be as big as possible without cracking a majority of Catholics, essentially saying that they made a Northern Ireland which would be 51% Protestant, just at the right balance to hold on to a unionist majority in that area. So this, the same idea of drawing lines in tricky ways in order to create a political balance that favors a group in power. It's not just solely restricted to electoral districting.
Yeah, and actually, just as you're saying that, I've just been following the live comments. So the first thing I was going to say was I decided to call the graphic the shape of American democracy, although I don't want to give the impression, I think, regardless of what you think about it, I wasn't trying to say that the shape of it is bad, but I was just trying to say more likely I should have called it the shapes of American democracy. But in relation to a comment from Lynn Brown there, actually, about whether compact districts are fair, I think that's a really important question. I would say not necessarily. And Jason's comment about considering more than the shape of the land, I would say yes. And that's what I try to do. When I wrote an explanation of this, I said, we shouldn't assume that a strange shape is bad. In fact, as Jason says, there's many good reasons why shapes could and should be unusual. So, usually you see a strange shape and people point the finger and say gerrymander, but actually there can be topographical reasons for that, but there can also be important ethical reasons, in my opinion.
And one of the interesting overlays in the United States, of course, it's also true in other places, but the United States has a particular history about this, is the way that districting and representation literally map on top of systems of racial segregation and racial spatial differentiation. So I have here a map of North Carolina's 12th district, which was recently, North Carolina's electoral map was ruled unconstitutional. And this congressional district that runs through several of the cities of North Carolina is essentially a district that was drawn to put as many African-American voters inside of one district as possible, drawn by the Republican majority in the process of what I referred to before as packing, so that in North Carolina, essentially black voters will get one representative because as many of them as possible are inside of the borders of this one district, right? What's complicated about that is, of course, the number of voters in a state can lead to different kind of political strategies for how you do this district drawing, right? So let's say that you have a state with 40% black voters, and a white districting commission draws the maps so that black voters aren't all caught in a single district, but instead they're divided so there's about 40% in every district. It may mean that they'll get no representatives at all. So in that case, drawing a so-called majority-minority district, which is one of the terms of the Voting Rights Act, the U.S. Voting Rights Act that was passed during the Civil Rights era, drawing a district can be advantageous because instead of a minority voting block being diluted across multiple districts, they'll be concentrated in one district that does have a representative. So there we see a kind of competing prerogatives. Is a, let's say, white Republican majority packing black voters into a single district to keep them from having more than one representative? Or is it being used for voting rights so that they're guaranteed at least one representative? And of course, no constituency is a perfect voting block. It's not as though every it's as though every black voter is a Democrat and every white voter is a Republican. In the United States, because of patterns of racially enforced segregation and because of the racial polarization of the parties, there's a strong correlation by race in terms of voting behavior. And that correlation literally maps onto the spatial geography of where people live in a state. So this 12th district in North Carolina was ruled unconstitutional. The state map was thrown up and redrawn. But this challenge of how does geography and districting and representation work together remains a very difficult one to figure out.
Yeah, I was going to say there, Garrett, as you were talking, I recently did a few chapters in a book, which was called Making Sense of Data in the Media. And if I can just stick up behind me, this is the evolution of North Carolina's 12th congressional district.
Great.
Various iterations up until the 115th Congress. And then what we have now in the most recent one is this is the current shape. I can move to the side. So you can see it's gone from that long, windy shape to much more uniform or compact, as we'd say. The thing I was going to say, in the UK context, what's interesting is, of course, we don't have proportional representation. We have a first past the post system. So, obviously, majority, you get the whole constituency. So a good example of why that might not be very representative, of course, is the Liberal Democrats, who often polled in the millions but had very few MPs. I'm Scottish, and obviously the Scottish Parliament has been going for 20 years, and they have proportional representation, and they run something which is a modified version of the so-called D'Hondt method. So we have geographic representation, but we also have representation to try and equalize the number of representatives relative to the vote, which most people would agree is a lot fairer. But of course, the problem is you can start a new parliament like that, but changing your existing legislatures is something that's just almost impossible. It would be preferable, but I don't see how it could be done politically, unfortunately.
Yeah. And of course, in the United States, congressional districts can be gerrymandered, but there's an entirely additional layer of kind of unfair representation that's created by the federal system of the Senate, right? Where state boundaries can't necessarily be gerrymandered, and that their borders are, at least for the past 50 years, fairly fixed. But because each state gets the same number of senators, regardless of if it has 700,000 people or 50 million people, it introduces another kind of geographic distortion into the representative system of the United States, which again has serious consequences for who has a political voice and who's given access to political voice at the federal level.
Yeah, and I thank you. I want to say thank you to PG and Ron, who brought up the issue of rotten boroughs in the United Kingdom. Obviously, we have a long history of deceit and dark arts in politics here. And obviously, if you're not familiar with a rotten borough, it's basically a case where you would have a very small population and you would have more or less very unrepresentative influence in the House of Commons. So these dark arts in the sort of geography, the political geography sphere, have always been around. It's just a change over time. So
let's talk actually a little bit about those dark arts, right? Your chart visualization is wonderful in that it lets us see at a glance the variety of shapes that already exist in these representative districts. But in fact, GIS and geographic data, in fact, and the power of computational methods have actually made it possible to do gerrymandering in ever more effective ways. Right? Yeah. So Elbridge Gerry in the early 19th century was essentially working with paper maps and a pen and trying to figure out, this town is known to vote for my party, and this town is known to be unfriendly to my party, and trying to cobble together a shape that would make sense. Now, with computer simulations, with kind of advanced demographic modeling of voter behavior, the political parties, the Republicans have a famous project called RedMap that uses a lot of sophisticated computer software, can generate these potential district models that are gerrymandered far better than Elbridge Gerry ever could have done with just a sketch map of Massachusetts. So I want to think a little bit about data and the way that data works. I'm going to come back to gerrymandering and some of the other ways that we can combat it at the end. But one of our big themes in Bending Lines is about who has the power to use data and for what ends, and what is missing in data. How do people interpret data? How do they use it? And I thought maybe we could talk about this project that you and I did, and what's in it, and also what it's leaving out, to think about the kind of social power of data in that way.
Okay, I'll explain it then. So what people are looking at, in case they haven't seen it, and I guess they haven't, is a map which shows the connections between the 74,000 or so US census tracts. And these lines are commuting. So they're point-to-point commuter connections. So everywhere that's connected has some level of commuting between it. And what you see is when you run this through an algorithm, you can use a network partitioning algorithm, as it's called, and we used one developed by people at MIT called Combo. And what this does is it runs through the data set and looks for those lines that are most strongly connected based on the total volume of commuters. And once you do that, then you can put these into different groups. And there's 50 different groups in this map, and they've got different colors. And what you can see, obviously, if you're familiar with the geography of the United States, is you can see these sort of metropolitan areas that are tied together by these lines, this nexus of interconnections. And some of these are quite clearly delineated, and others are much more sort of interwoven and intermeshed. So, for example, you can see on the screen how New York City sort of bleeds into New Jersey, which then, it's a whole East Coast megalopolis, as the French geographer Jean Gottman called it. But in other parts of the country, there's much more separation. So this was our attempt to try and understand the economic geography of the United States using a data set that was actually quite tricky to work with. But once we got going, it sort of threw up some interesting things.
And that idea of, you did an interview in Springer Nature called Data Needs People, right? And that's something that we've really emphasized in the Bending Lines exhibition, is that, this map obviously didn't just drop down from the sky. You and I we connected across seas to make it. It used the training that both you and I had in our respective disciplines. But also, it can be a tricky sort of map, right? In that people are, in the one hand, look at this and say, wow, that's so amazing. There's so much data in it. And you and I think, have been cautious to say, well, let's think about how much is missing from this map, right? It's only capturing commuters. So people who aren't in the workforce, elderly people, children, are not measured in this form of regional delineation. This is related to a gerrymandering map, right? In that we're doing the process of drawing regions that seem to be whole and have a kind of bordered, contained status to them. But we're actually not drawing hard borders here, even though there's one way of looking at it with the colors and the regional lines of saying, oh, these are, this is where the Boston region ends and the, upstate New York region begins. But actually embedded even within the data and the methods are these more ambiguous sense of enclosure and boundedness. So that data itself is telling a more complicated story than even with our interpretation and our warnings about its limitations. It's always kind of getting away from us in that sense.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. I mean, this is a kind of map, right? People look at it and go, ooh, shiny map, right? And think you just want to look at something shiny, and that's something that I feel. I see a shiny map and I want to look at it, and it's interesting. But there's so many different levels here that I think are important. You're right to say, what does the map not show? People who work at home, people who don't have a job. It doesn't actually tell you anything of the pain of commuting. If there's one thing we know about commuting, it can be soul destroying. So this is a shiny map which masks all that. And I've done that. I commuted between Liverpool and Manchester for a couple of years actually, and it wasn't very joyous or shiny. And this map masks that kind of stuff. But what it also does is it doesn't show where people would like to go. It shows you where people do go, and that's based on obviously stuff like underlying infrastructure. In some parts of the Northeast, of course, you've got pretty good public transit infrastructure. In other parts, less so. And then you look more closely, and you see things like, say a part of northern Ohio. I guess it's around Toledo, essentially, which bleeds into Michigan, and of course, famous interstate rivalries that might not go down too well, but this is essentially saying this is how it is, not based on what we think, but we're just plugging the numbers into the data set. And what's interesting about the people element of this, of course, I don't know if you're going to mention this, but when we did the AMA on Reddit, people looked at the map and said, oh, wow, these guys have drawn all these amazing lines. And my point was number one, that we didn't draw anything. And that number two, it's based on the decisions of millions and millions, 130 million actually, individual commuters. And this is not, where they go is not always based on proximity. It can be to do with, cultural ties. If you're halfway between two cities, which way do you turn? You know,
Yep.
if you're Wisconsin and Chicago and you're halfway, maybe it could be something to do with local tax regimes.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? There's lots of things going on that you can't see.
Mm-hmm.
And with a map like this, we were just trying to, as a starting point, visualize it, which can then lead you to understand more about the underlying stories.
So to get back to the idea about gerrymandering, I wanted to counterpose two ways of kind of thinking about how would you draw a perfectly fair district. This is from Bill Bungie. I don't know, have you ever seen this paper, Ali? It's called Geography, Gerrymandering, and Grouping. We talked about Bill Bungie in the very early bit of this broadcast with his anti-racist maps of Fitzgerald in Detroit. But Bungie was, really got his start as a mathematical modeler, and he proposed, well, we could just use mathematical models like hexagons to divide an area like the United States into, the United Kingdom into as compact areas as possible, and produce something like this: Britain divided into 11 compact regions. That's
can I interrupt you to say this is the perfect method for like causing outrage in this country, but carry on.
Yeah, so counterposing something like this, which has a kind of mathematical elegance to it, to this project, which you already talked about, the group at Moon Duchin's group out of Tufts. This is a interactive web project that they developed. Really a beautiful piece of participatory geography. You can find it embedded into Bending Lines, or its own website called Districtor. And in Districtor, people are invited to draw their own electoral maps, which gives another way of thinking about electoral geography, is that people, to the extent possible, should be allowed to vote in communities that make sense to them, to say that, this is the part of my city or the part of my state that I feel like I have a political connection with, and it would make sense for that area to send a representative to the state House of Representatives or to the federal Congress, right? So by gathering participatory data, like is done in the Districtor project, we can get a much more kind of qualitative sense of where people think boundaries and borders ought to be drawn. And those are in somewhat of a tension with one another, right? Because although the idea of people drawing their own boundaries sounds great, well, look at the processes of segregation and exclusion which already go on in our country. Those are already created by people's kind of unjust geographic associations of who's with us and who's not with us, right? So one could imagine a white suburbanite saying, well, I'd really much rather be in a district with other white suburbanites and not with people of color in the cities. So are these participatorily drawn maps better or worse than something that has this kind of abstract mathematical simplicity, like Bungie dividing the UK into 11 regions? I would say that in some sense, we have to take both of them into context with historical patterns of who has had representation, what kind of a representative system do we want to build, and thinking of it much more of a political challenge than a data challenge in that sense, right? It's not as if the data is ever going to get us the perfect electoral map. The data can tell us things about one electoral map versus another, but until we have a theory about who's voting and whose voice is and isn't heard, it's much more difficult to say, is this a good or a bad map? I want to think a little bit more about kind of data and the way that it circulates in political debates by looking at a couple of other projects that you've done, Ali. So this is, I pulled this out of a really wonderful project I know you've been working on and continue to work on about the spatial patterns of deprivation in the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, this is from my Atlas of Inequality, which focused on England, which I completed last year. And it does sound slightly unusual using the language and the word, in particular deprivation. I suppose in a US context, you'd most commonly talk about disadvantage or poverty. So those aren't exactly the same concepts, but they're very much overlapping. And one of the things the government does in the UK, actually the four different governments in the UK, they produce this data set every few years called the Index of Deprivation, and it's for very small areas. So this is a map that you're looking at of a large town in the northeast of England. It's Middlesbrough. And those red areas are amongst the poorest 20% within England. And obviously the blue ones are amongst the least deprived. So it's not the same as rich and poor, but as far as we're concerned, it more or less is. So the blue areas would be the rich ones. And Middlesbrough, you can see, the geographical concentration. It's not a surprise. We see this all over the world. So one of the things that I thought would be interesting to do was try and understand this, going a little bit beyond the basic pattern. So we looked at these patterns, myself and my colleague Elvis Nyanzu, who worked on it with me. We did it for the whole of England, and we looked at not just where the highest levels of deprivation were, but what the patterns were like. Were they geographically concentrated? Were they spread out? And these things can have different implications. In the UK, it might be to do with school provision or public transit and so on. But so that was the project, an atlas of inequality. People have done this kind of thing before, but not in England, and not using such up-to-date data.
Mm-hmm. And how can you say something about how the work has been received in the public, and also maybe we could talk in the same conversation about the way that maps can become objects of controversy. Saying something about your "Is England Full" map, and the way that kind of got caught up in xenophobic debates about British immigration.
Yeah, in relation to how the sort of inequality stuff was used, it was covered in the media, fairly widely. But at the time, it was just before the general election. We keep having elections in this country very regularly. The last one was obviously last year. But it fed into some of the debates about that, because all the political parties had paid lip service at least to eliminating inequalities and tackling inequalities. And now with the coronavirus situation and beyond, there will be disproportionate and unequal effects of that in places like Middlesbrough. And, the recovery is going to need geographically tailored intervention. Mm-hmm. In relation to controversy, well, one of the most, I suppose, controversial topics in the UK over the last 15 to 20 years has been things to do with migration. And one of the questions that always arises in the newspapers, specifically in England, I would say the UK, but actually more so just England, is about this question of England being full. Now, that's a very emotive statement. There's different ways of looking at it, and I can understand different perspectives. England it's certainly a small country by world standards, and certainly by American standards. There's 130,000 square kilometers, and the population of England is about 54 million. And of course, if you draw a circle around London of about 60 miles, you get about 16 million people. So it's very densely populated in places. But there was this question about England being the most densely populated. So to cut a long story short, what I did was I derived a measure of population density that made more sense to me, because dividing people by land area to get to a figure doesn't really make sense to me. And the prime example of that is Russia. So if you take the population of Russia and you compare it to the land area, you're going to get a figure, the arithmetic mean, which says it's very low population density. But of course, that's not what people experience in their lives in most cases in Russia, because most people live in Moscow and St. Petersburg and Nizhny Novgorod and all those kind of places. So I tried to develop a measure which took into account only where people live, and that's what I did. England still comes out very dense, but not quite number one. And of course, when you do that on a global level, when you compare it to places like the Philippines or Bangladesh, for example, or Singapore or Hong Kong, it's not quite the same. But actually, this was picked up by various newspapers, and the one here that you've got on screen is the Daily Mail, which a lot of people would consider not the most prestigious outlet to appear in if you're an academic, if I can say that. But it was a piece I published that can be republished, and it had 1,000 comments on it. And of course, it doesn't make great reading if you're me reading the comments, but I think it was important to try and put something out there. And actually, to be fair to them, it was a science correspondent who republished it, and it was done relatively well, all things considered.
But the way that it can get caught up, these so seemingly kind of cool and rational statistics get enmeshed into political debates, right? For a xenophobic political perspective that thinks, of course, England is full. Something like this seems like, well, that can't possibly be right. We have another map that I wanted to compare it to in the exhibition. This is an early 20th century map of ethnic groups in Southeastern Europe, Central and Southeastern Europe. And the geographer Jeremy Crampton has written a little bit about how the very idea of choropleth maps reinforces this idea of distinct, separate entities, right? Of course, these kind of ethnographic maps were hugely influential in the ethnic nationalist struggles of the early 20th century in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe. And maps like these, just in their very visual language and in their assumption that there, was a fundamental difference between Hungarians and Croats and Slovenes and Germans, drawing that into a choropleth map reproduced a political argument about territory, about ethnicity, about nationhood, right? So I'm not trying to compare your population maps, of course, to these early 20th century ethno-nationalist assumptions, but even the most kind of cool scientific seeming portrayals of information have assumptions built into them, right? The way that we categorize and organize and then visualize the world is already embedded, is always kind of laden with the ways that we think that the world works.
I just reinforce what you'd say. Basically, it's looking at a map like that. It's a really good example if you know people from there and you understand their reactions to something like that. If they're not in one of the dominant groups within an area, these kind of things are very powerful and they can have a huge impact and influence. And we know this if we study maps, but I think what's different today is that the number of people seeing maps, sharing maps, and consuming them is way beyond anything that's ever happened before. And that's different from words. Maps are just obviously a form of communication. And I think it's difficult to try and explain things when you have an audience who weren't necessarily the intended target of your map. And I think some of the stuff I've done, it gets you into trouble because people, from that thing that appeared in the Daily Mail, I got letters or phone calls to my office at university. And I can understand people, people think I had an agenda and I'm part of some metropolitan liberal elite and I want the country to have double the population, all that kind of stuff, which is not true. But by the same token, I think anything to do with geography is going to be emotive. And a very simple example of that, and this is maybe a little bit of a tip for anyone who's doing stuff on the UK, anything you see on data in the UK will typically break it down into sub-units. And one of the ways you do that is by region in England, and you have 9 regions. And then you have Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. Now, if you call Scotland a region, when you're doing some simple basic data analysis, that is likely to infuriate everybody in Scotland. And actually, even though I know people are using it as a kind of seemingly neutral word, that still annoys me. So there's even the slightest thing like that, which seems quite pedantic and small, can kind of cause very small level of harm, which can then influence the message and cause people not to hear you, and also assume darker motives. And it's, that today as well is another problem with public discourse, which we probably haven't got time to discuss.
Yeah. So we're getting towards the top of the hour. I want to give some time for our viewers on YouTube and Facebook to ask some questions. If you post in the comments, either in Facebook or YouTube, we should be able to see them, and we'll bring in as many as we can for Alasdair and I to take a look at, and then we'll wrap up the show in a few minutes. So here's a question. Ideally, there's more to consider than just the shape of the land. An ethically designed district needs to take into account the communities of people that live there, which don't always fit into neat shapes. So we've already talked a little bit about that. How do we design an ethically drawn electoral district, and how do we situate that in our theories of representation and our understanding of the ways that, especially in the United States, political and racial patterns of spatial segregation, spatial differentiation map on top of one another. What do you think? How, if you were to draw a fair district, Ali, how would you do it?
Well, am I allowed to say that we should have a method of representation which is not just geographical? That's the fairest way. I mean, that's what I was saying before about the Scottish Parliament. As imperfect as any parliament is, you have your MSPs, your members of the Scottish Parliament, who represent geographical areas, and then you have what we call list MPs, and that's made up based on the proportion of votes. Now, if you can't have that because of the politics, the reality of politics, then I think at the very least you have to have some kind of independence when it comes to the drawing of boundaries. And I know that happens in some states, right, but not necessarily everywhere, and certainly not in every country. So I think it's about setting up a legal infrastructure where that can happen. And if that's not possible, then I think what you see is continuation of shapes and boundaries that don't necessarily give the best representation.
Yep. So in some ways, there's a kind of to be humble about what GIS and geography can do, right? Maybe the answer is that we need fairer, more robust, more representative political systems, right? Could be that a bipartisan electoral district does much better than some, geometric sort of algorithmic technique for drawing a district.
Yeah, I think that's true. Sometimes, the automatic processes we use, we think they're neutral because it's done by a machine, but of course there's biases built into that, and we all know that from seeing these stories about AI and what it can do and how it's biased, and all the algorithms are they're designed and built by humans, right? So it reinforces existing underlying prejudices, of course. But as long as we're aware of that, I would say as long as we're aware of that, then I think we can use the technology to our advantage.
Another question says, senses of scale are so important here too. In New England, for example, towns are so small compared to municipalities in the West. The state of Rhode Island is the same size as the city of Phoenix. Yeah, we talked last week a little bit about the process of normalization, right? Where you divide the statistics in an area by their population, and the way that can lead to very misleading conclusions. And of course, the building blocks of these districts look very different, as the question noted, depending on whether you're using New England towns, very small, or huge city counties in certain places of the West. There's also different historical patterns of population distribution in different parts of the United States. The West tends to be, we think of it as less dense, but actually the cities of the West, the far West, tend to actually contain larger fractions of their population, right? So a larger fraction of Colorado is in metro dense, and let's say in a place like New Hampshire, which is, but also has kind of flatter population distribution. Let's see, any other questions here? Fair Vote has proposed multi-member districts which allow for a form of proportionality. What do you think about that?
Yes, a very good idea. Yeah, I think these things, some of the problems with these ideas, of course, is what we might call reality, unfortunately. And do you decide at some point it's worth a 30-year struggle to try and change some of this stuff, or do you accept the least worst outcome and compromise? And I think obviously that's essentially what politics is, isn't it? And talking about some of these questions, proportionality, excellent. I do think the Rhode Island versus Phoenix comparison is a good one, and I could look at to use another UK example, the constituencies in the UK, 650, usually have population in the region of 100,000 people, but there's a few exceptions, and a couple of those exceptions would be the Northern Isles of Orkney and Shetland, and the Western Isles of the Outer Hebrides. And the argument there, and it applies to some places in the United States, is that these places are so geographically and culturally different that to not have separate representation for them would be less democratic. And also, it would be, for a number of reasons, it would be very complicated, but actually that's sort of accepted, and there's a consensus on that. And maybe it's to do with history, but it's to do with a variety of things. From my own perspective, having spent a bit of time in the United States, seeing the geographical diversity and the Arizona versus Rhode Island example is a good one. How do you fit something that's fair in so many different contexts? The answer is I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we're just about at 2 p.m. here in East Coast time. What are you at, 7 p.m. Over there?
Yep,
yeah. Thanks for staying up through dinner for us. For those
me.
of you all around the world, staying up until whatever hour it is in your own time zone. I just wanted to say this is the second in a 4-part series of online talks we're doing as part of our online exhibition, Bending Lines, Maps and Data from Distortion to Deception. We have 2 more upcoming talks, each on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Next week, Judith Tyner, a coiner of the term persuasive cartography, is joining us from California. And the week after that, PJ Mode will join us to talk about some maps from his collection, and of course, at Cornell University Libraries, some of which are shown in Bending Lines, and talk about different degrees and methods of deceptive behavior in map making. I also want to say that if you have a chance after the talk, we'd love to get your feedback. Thank you all for being patient with our internet connections. I guess we've learned that the UK has better and more reliable internet than Boston does. But if you have a chance, this link, bit.ly/BL-participant, we'd love to get your feedback on how you've been enjoying the talks, as well as the digital exhibition itself. And of course, that digital exhibition, put on the screen one more time, leventhalmap.org/digital-exhibitions/bending lines, also linked to from our website. Encourage you to explore, engage, draw your own electoral districting map with the Districtor tool, and tell us what you think. But most of all, I want to thank Alasdair Rae, an excellent guest.
Thank you.
Make sure you take a look again in greater depth, zoom in close on his map of the shape of American democracy in Bending Lines. Alasdair, it's been great to have you. I'm Garrett Nelson from the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. We'll see you all next week.
See you later. Thanks.
Bye.